the genteel dining room of London's Onslow Court Hotel, he was the picture of charm. Well-dressed, well-spoken, an inventor and engineer. But in a small, grimy workshop in Crawley, he was something else entirely. A man who believed he needed blood to survive. A man who had perfected a method of murder so gruesome, he was sure it was the perfect crime. No body, no evidence, no case. This is the story of John George Hay, also known as the Acid Bath Murderer. John George Hay's story does not begin in a murky workshop with acid drums, but in a stark, confined yard in the village of Outwood, West Yorkshire. Born on July 24, 1909, to John Robert Hay and Emily Hudson, his entire worldview was sculpted from its inception by the severe and uncompromising doctrines of the Plymouth Brethren. This was not merely a strict religion. It was an all-encompassing reality where the outside world was portrayed as a cesspool of sin and damnation. Casual entertainment, music, magazines, and sports were not just frivolous distractions. They were considered direct pathways to eternal punishment. The only stories tolerated were those from the Bible, creating a cultural and intellectual vacuum around the young boy. His father, John Robert, was so convinced of the world's inherent evil that he took a profoundly physical step to isolate his son. He built a 10-foot-high fence around their property. This fence was more than just wood and nails. It was a symbolic and literal barrier, a declaration that everything beyond it was corrupt and dangerous. Hay later described this period as bleak and lonely, a sentiment that barely scratches the surface of the profound isolation he must have felt. He had very few, if any, real friends, and his social interactions were likely limited to the small, insular community of the Brethren. This isolation meant he never developed the normal social cues and empathy that come from childhood interactions. Within this claustrophobic environment, his father employed a powerful and terrifying psychological tool to ensure obedience. He had a blue scar on his forehead. He did not dismiss it as a simple birthmark or an old injury. Instead, he told his young, impressionable son that it was the mark of the devil, placed there as a permanent reminder of his own sinful indulgences during his youth. For a child, this made sin tangible. It wasn't an abstract concept, it was a visible blue stain that God, or the devil, would imprint on your skin as a brand of shame. The message was brutally simple. Step out of line, and you will be physically marked for life. This image of the blue scar haunted Hay, creating a deep-seated terror of divine retribution that would, paradoxically, set the stage for his later rebellion. The fence and the scar worked in tandem. One corralled his body, the other imprisoned his mind. This was the crucible in which the man known as the Acid Bath Murderer was forged, a beginning defined not by love and exploration, but by fear, restriction, and the looming threat of a demonic brand. As John Hay grew older, approaching the age of 10, the absolute authority of his parents and their religious beliefs began to show cracks. He began to secretly push against the rigid rules that governed his life. He started to commit what his parents would have considered small sins. He sought out and read non-religious books, discovering worlds and ideas beyond the fire and brimstone narratives of the Bible. He found ways to engage with music, likely the classical music he would later come to appreciate, an art form his parents condemned as sinful. With each forbidden book read and each secret melody enjoyed, he would anxiously examine his own forehead in a mirror, waiting for the blue scar of the devil to appear. And day after day, week after week, it never did. This was a pivotal, life-altering revelation for the boy. The central threat that underpinned his entire upbringing, the promise of immediate, visible divine punishment, had proven to be a lie. This did not lead him to a more nuanced understanding of faith. Instead, it created two powerful and dangerous convictions in his young mind. First, he believed he was somehow special, invincible, and immune to the consequences that governed other people. Second, it made him fundamentally question everything he had been taught, all the things about God. This spiritual crisis stripped away the moral framework of his childhood without replacing it with anything else, leaving a void where his conscience should have been. Alongside this waking rebellion, his subconscious was tormented by a series of recurring and vivid nightmares that would stay with him for life. He dreamt of a forest where crucifixes turned into trees that dripped with blood. In this macabre landscape, a shadowy figure would move between the trees, collecting the blood in a large cup. The dream was always the same. and it always ended at the same frustrating point. The man would raise the cup to his lips, but Hay would wake up before he could take a drink. He later told police that these relentless dreams convinced him that he himself needed blood to live, and it was widely reported that his childhood ambition was to become a vampire. This fusion of a shattered religious upbringing and violent, psychological delusions created a perfect storm. The boy who was taught he would be marked for sin discovered he could sin without consequence, and the boy who dreamed of drinking blood was no longer afraid of a devil who failed to leave his mark. The fence still stood around the property, but the walls in his mind had begun to crumble, revealing a dark and uncharted interior landscape. Emerging from the oppressive atmosphere of his home, John Hay entered adulthood presenting a face to the world that was the complete opposite of his bleak upbringing. He was well-groomed, confident, and possessed a charm that easily impressed those he met, particularly women. He was also intellectually gifted, winning a scholarship to the prestigious Queen Elizabeth Grammar School in Wakefield. There, he was remembered as a brainy lad though a bit of a loner, a description that hints at the social isolation of his youth persisting even in a new environment. Hay also became a choir boy at Wakefield Cathedral, standing in the hallowed space singing hymns, a picture of piety that masked his growing internal turmoil and the questions about faith festering inside him. After finishing school, he was apprenticed to a firm of motor engineers, showing an early technical aptitude. However, the crooked streak that would define his life soon emerged. At 21, he was fired from this position after being accused of stealing from a cash box. At age 25, he married 21-year-old Beatrice Hammer after a whirlwind courtship of only 4 months. It is highly likely that Hay saw this marriage less as a romance and more as an escape hatch, a legal and social mechanism to finally break free from his parents' strict regime and the shadow of the 10-foot fence. Indeed, after the marriage, he promptly stopped attending church altogether, shedding the last visible remnant of his forced upbringing. But his new adult life came with new pressures, primarily the need to sustain a lifestyle that matched his charming facade. Unwilling or unable to rely on slow, honest work, he turned to crime, using his intelligence for forgery by creating fraudulent vehicle documents. This venture was short-lived. In November 1934, just a few months after his wedding, he was caught and sentenced to 15 months in prison for fraud. While he sat in a cell, his wife Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. Faced with the prospect of raising a child alone while her husband was incarcerated, she made the heartbreaking decision to put the baby up for adoption and subsequently filed for divorce. In a final blow, Hay's own family, undoubtedly shamed by his criminality, cut ties with him completely. In a very short period, Hay had lost his freedom, his wife, his child, and his family. The invincible facade had cracked, but the man behind it only grew more hardened. The world outside prison gates in the mid-1930s offered John Hay little welcome. He was a divorced ex-convict, estranged from his family, and starting from scratch. His first attempt at legitimacy after his release was a dry cleaning business he started with a friend. The business was beginning to find its footing and achieve a measure of success. But then tragedy, or what Hay perceived as a cosmic sign, struck. His business partner was killed in a sudden motorcycle accident. The venture collapsed. In Hay's distorted worldview, this wasn't a random tragedy. It was a definitive message from the universe. He took it as a powerful reinforcement of his belief that honest work was futile and that a life of crime was the only true way to secure the wealth and status he craved. In 1936, now in his late 20s, he moved to London, a city large enough to offer anonymity and new opportunities for his criminal ambitions. It was here he met William McSwan, the son of a wealthy family, Donald and Amy McSwan, who owned a chain of amusement arcades. Hay was hired by the family as a chauffeur and to repair their arcade machines, placing him in direct, daily view of a lavish lifestyle he deeply envied. He befriended William, all the while seething with resentment over the wealth that seemed to come so easily to the family. While maintaining this friendship, he continued his shady dealings on the side, operating under the alias William Cato Adamson. His scheme involved selling fraudulent stock shares, purportedly from the estates of deceased clients, at irresistibly low rates. But his downfall was almost comically trivial. An observant client noticed a critical misspelling on Hay's professional letterhead. He had written Guilford instead of Guilford. This small error unraveled the entire operation. At age 28, Hay was once again convicted and sentenced, this time to a longer, more substantial 4 years in prison. It was during this protracted period of incarceration, with ample time for bitter reflection, that Hay had his most monstrous epiphany. He concluded that his past failures were not due to poor planning or simple bad luck, but because of a fundamental flaw in his method. He had left his victims alive. He began to spend his free time in the prison library, not for self-improvement, but to research the perfect crime. It was there he studied the work of French murderer Georges Seurat, who had used sulfuric acid to dispose of a victim's body. Hay, ever the experimenter, began his own gruesome tests. Using glass jars from the prison kitchen and dead field mice smuggled in from the fields, he used small quantities of acid pilfered from the tinsmith's shop. He meticulously timed the process, noting it took about 30 minutes to dissolve a small mouse. From these macabre experiments, he extrapolated the calculations, the amount of acid and the precise time it would take to dissolve a full-grown adult. The formula was elegant in its horror. No body, no evidence. No evidence, no crime. Upon his release from prison in 1940, John Hay's path was set, but the war provided both chaos and opportunity. He soon found himself back behind bars, however, serving a 21-month sentence for breaking and entering. This final stint in jail seemed to solidify his resolve. Once free, he worked briefly as a salesman, but his mind was focused on executing his plan. Fate, or rather a chance encounter in a pub, intervened when he bumped into his old friend and former employer, William McSwan. Hay knew McSwan was collecting rents from his parents' various properties, a steady stream of cash that fueled his intense envy of what he saw as McSwan's effortless, lavish lifestyle. They rekindled their friendship, and Hay also grew closer to William's parents, Donald and Amy, all while secretly viewing them not as people, but as prospects. To put his plan into motion, he rented a small, discreet basement workshop at 79 Gloucester Road, presenting it as a place where he would work on his inventions. In reality, it was a slaughterhouse. He equipped it with 40-gallon drums, a rubber apron, Wellington boots, and a gas mask. On Saturday, September 9, 1944, the theory he developed in prison was put to the test. He lured William McSwan to the workshop. Once inside, he smashed McSwan in the head with a lead pipe. He later confessed that he then slit his throat, and in a chilling act that connected back to his childhood nightmares, he said, "I got a mug and took some blood from his neck, in the mug and drank it." He then stripped the body, placed it in one of the 40-gallon drums, and poured in concentrated sulfuric acid. The chemical reaction was violent. The fumes were so overwhelming he had to retreat outside for air. He left his former friend and employer to dissolve into liquid sludge, returning 2 days later to pour the thick, black, tar-like residue down a drain in the road behind his workshop under the cover of night. The immediate problem of the body was solved, but the problem of the missing person remained. When Donald and Amy McSwan grew worried about their son's disappearance, Hay was ready with a plausible lie. He told them William had fled to Scotland to avoid being drafted into the ongoing war. The family, aware of William's fear of conscription, tragically believed him. Hay then smoothly inserted himself into their lives, taking over William's role of collecting the rents and even living in the McSwan family home. To maintain the charade, he began forging letters and postcards, posing as William to assure his parents he was safe. As the war ended in 1945, their anxiety grew. Why hadn't William returned? Hay devised a new story, telling the elderly couple that William was making a secret, fleeting visit to London and had arranged to meet them at his workshop. He stressed the need for discretion, ensuring they told no one of the planned reunion. On July 2, 1945, Donald McSwan arrived first and was led down to the basement, where Hay bludgeoned him to death. He then went upstairs, retrieved Amy, and repeated the horrific act. Now faced with two bodies, he refined his process. He dismembered the couple to accelerate the dissolution and used a new, larger container, a steel bathtub, submerging their body parts in a mixture of sulfuric and hydrochloric acid. A few days later, they too were poured down the drain. To explain their disappearance, he told their landlady the couple had suddenly decided to move to America. He had all their mail, including Donald's pension checks, forwarded to him. Posing as William McSwan, he forged a power of attorney document, granting him legal control over the family's entire estate. He systematically sold off their properties, netting between £6,000 and £8,000, a fortune equivalent to roughly £250,000 today. With this blood money, he moved into the luxurious Onslow Court Hotel in Kensington, finally achieving the lavish lifestyle he had always coveted. The fortune Hay had stolen from the McSwan family did not last. By 1947, the money was nearly gone, dissipated by his lavish lifestyle at the Onslow Court Hotel and a persistent gambling habit. The need for more money was urgent, and his solution was to revert to the only method that had ever worked for him. He no longer had his basement workshop at Gloucester Road and needed a new, discreet location for his grim work. He found a small storage space at 2 Leopold Road in Crawley, Sussex, just outside of London. He moved all his equipment, the drums, the acids, the protective gear, to this new, more isolated location. His next targets were Dr. Archibald Henderson, a 52-year-old physician, and his 41-year-old wife, Rose. Hay pretended to be interested in a house the Hendersons were selling, a ruse that allowed him to build a rapport with the couple. He even managed to get himself invited to their housewarming party, where he used the opportunity to steal their .38 caliber Webley revolver, arming himself for his new, more efficient method of killing. He continued to cultivate their trust, presenting himself as a successful inventor and engineer. On February 12, 1948, he drove Dr. Henderson to his Crawley workshop under the guise of showing him a new invention and proposing a business partnership. Once inside, Hay shot Henderson in the back of the head with the stolen revolver, killing him instantly. He stripped the body of valuables and, in a departure from his earlier method, placed the entire body into a 40-gallon drum filled with sulfuric acid, deciding dismemberment was not necessary. He then lured Rose Henderson to the workshop by claiming her husband had fallen suddenly ill. As she arrived, anxious and unsuspecting, he shot her and placed her body in a second drum of acid. He left the bodies to dissolve over the weekend, later emptying the barrel's contents into the backyard under the cover of darkness. The pawned belongings of the Hendersons yielded a disappointing £200, a paltry sum for a double murder. In a bizarre and callous detail, he also kept their car and their dog. To explain their disappearance, Hay forged a series of letters, including a lengthy one purportedly from Rose to her brother, detailing their sudden decision to emigrate to South Africa. He claimed Dr. Henderson had to flee because he had performed an illegal abortion. He then used forged documents to sell their property, ultimately acquiring around £8,000. This money sustained him for little over a year. By February 1949, he was financially desperate once more. His final victim was another resident of the Onslow Court Hotel, 69-year-old Olive Durand Deacon, a wealthy widow. They had been casual acquaintances for years, often chatting during meals. On February 14, 1949, over lunch, Mrs. Durand Deacon mentioned her idea for manufacturing artificial fingernails. Hay saw an immediate opportunity, presenting himself as the ideal person to help develop her idea. He invited her to his workshop in Crawley on Friday, February 18th. There, he shot her in the back of the neck with the same Webley revolver, stripped her of her valuables, including a distinctive Persian lamb coat, and consigned her body to an acid bath. This murder was his most reckless and hurried. He had no elaborate cover story prepared and no clear plan to access her wealth. He returned to the hotel that evening and calmly enjoyed a 3-course meal. When he returned to his workshop to dispose of the remains, he discovered a critical failure in his process. Olive Durand Deacon's body had not fully dissolved, and recognizable human fragments remained as he poured the sludge into the yard. The disappearance of Olive Durand Deacon did not go unnoticed for long. Her close friend and fellow resident at the Onslow Court Hotel, Mrs. Constance Lane, grew deeply concerned when she failed to return. Knowing that Olive had planned to visit Hayes' workshop, Mrs. Lane confronted him. "Don't you know where she is?" she demanded. "She told me you were taking her down to your factory." "Well, I must do something about that." In a calculated move designed to deflect suspicion, Hay did not avoid her. Instead, he offered to accompany her to the police station to report the matter himself. This performance of the concerned citizen, however, did not have its intended effect. The police officer who took their statement, Policewoman Sergeant Lambourne, was immediately suspicious of Hayes' manner. His story seemed too smooth, his demeanor too calm. While the initial report was filed as a missing persons case, Sergeant Lambourne's instincts prompted a deeper look. On Monday, February 21st, Scotland Yard's Criminal Record Office was contacted, and Hayes' extensive history of fraud and imprisonment was revealed, transforming him from a helpful witness into a prime suspect. He was asked to give further statements on Thursday, February 24th, during which he tried to maintain his facade, but the net was tightening. Unaware of how much the police knew, Hay likely believed his confidence alone could carry him through. Meanwhile, the police were gathering enough evidence for a search warrant. On Saturday, February 26th, a team of officers arrived at 2 Leopold Road in Crawley and forced the door open. Inside the grimy workshop, they found the tools of his trade, a rubber apron, a gas mask, and several empty 40-gallon drums. More incriminatingly, they discovered the .38 caliber Webley revolver he had stolen from the Hendersons. But the most damning piece of evidence, one that directly linked him to the victim, was a dry-cleaning ticket. It was for a Persian lamb coat, the very coat Olive Durand Deacon had been wearing when she vanished. Hay, in his haste, had failed to properly dispose of it after the coat became bloodied during the shooting. At 4:15 p.m. on Monday, February 28th, Detective Inspector Albert Webb waited for Hay to return to the Onslow Court Hotel. Upon his arrival, he was taken to the police station for formal questioning. Confronted with the growing evidence, and perhaps still clinging to the arrogant belief in his own invincibility, Hay decided to confess that very night. He laid out the details of Olive Durand Deacon's murder, coolly stating, "I've destroyed her with acid. You will find her in the sludge that remains at Leopold Road. Every trace is gone. How can you prove a murder if there is no body?" He then went further, casually mentioning the murders of the McSwans and the Hendersons, and shocking the officers with the claim that he had killed them so he could drink their blood. He even boasted of 3 other unconfirmed murders, relishing in the monstrous image he was projecting. Yet, his entire confession was underpinned by that one confident challenge. Without a body, a conviction for murder was impossible. He was certain the acid had done its job. The police, however, were not ready to concede. The sludge from his yard was not simply washed away. It was meticulously collected. Renowned pathologist Dr. Keith Simpson was called to the scene. His forensic examination of the workshop and the residue from the yard was painstaking. He found bloodstains on the walls and at the bottom of a 45-gallon drum. But the real breakthrough came from the vile sludge itself. As Dr. Simpson and his team sifted through the bucketfuls of semi-liquid debris, they recovered 28 pounds of human fat, a part of a human foot, 3 gallstones, and, most significantly, a full set of dentures. Olive Duran Deacon's dentist was summoned and was able to positively identify the dentures as belonging to her. With the discovery of Olive Duran Deacon's dentures and other remains, John George Hays' fate was sealed. He was formally charged with her murder on March 2, 1949, and remanded to Lewes Prison to await trial. The proceedings began at Lewes Assizes on July 18, 1949, and became a national sensation, drawing intense public and media scrutiny. His defense team, led by Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, entered a plea of insanity. They argued that his vampiric delusions, his belief that he needed to drink blood, along with his violent nightmares and bizarre behavior, proved he was not guilty by reason of insanity. Hay himself fully cooperated with this strategy. In a desperate attempt to appear mad, he reportedly drank his own urine while in his cell, believing this would convince the authorities of his lunacy. The prosecution, however, painted a very different picture, that of a cold, calculating, and highly intelligent man who had planned his crimes with meticulous precision for sheer financial gain. The jury was presented with two John Hays, the psychotic vampire and the cunning, greedy businessman. The trial was swift. After hearing all the evidence, the jury retired to consider their verdict. They took just 17 minutes to reach a decision. They rejected the insanity plea and found John George Hay guilty of murder. The judge donned the black cap and pronounced the mandatory sentence, death by hanging. Hay, who had hoped to be confined to a mental hospital for the rest of his life, was instead condemned to die. On the morning of Wednesday, August 10, 1949, a crowd of approximately 500 people gathered outside the gates of Wandsworth Prison under a bright summer sun. At 9 o'clock precisely, within the walls of the prison, Hay was executed by the renowned hangman Albert Pierpoint, assisted by Harry Kirk. In a final grotesque act that perfectly encapsulated his lifelong obsession with image and status, Hay had agreed prior to his execution to the creation of a death mask for Madame Tussauds Waxwork Museum. He even bequeathed his own clothes to the museum, with the specific stipulation that his waxwork figure must always be kept impeccably dressed, the trousers neatly creased, the shirt cuffs showing, the hair perfectly parted. He wanted to be remembered not as a monster in rags, but as the charming, well-groomed gentleman he had always pretended to be. His waxwork was promptly installed in the Chamber of Horrors, where it stood as a chilling reminder of the man who believed he could dissolve his victims into nothingness. The case of the acid bath murderer left a permanent mark on British criminal history, setting a legal precedent for prosecuting murder based on strong circumstantial and forensic evidence, even in the absence of a complete body. John Hay discovered too late that while flesh and bone can be dissolved, evidence of a life, and the proof of its violent end, has a stubborn way of enduring. Thank you for coming with me on this deep dive. Do subscribe to the channel if you have not done so. We are on a journey to 100 subscribers. Thank you once again for your time. I will be seeing you on our next episode.